Through just 7 systematic pairings, a researcher took a completely fearless 9-month-old baby and engineered a severe phobia. The baby left the lab terrified of harmless white rabbits and fur coats. His follow-up appointment for reprogramming got canceled and was never rescheduled. But this wasn't just a clinical experiment. The man who unlocked fear took those exact same psychological blueprints, left academia, and spent the rest of his career using them to program the consumer. That's us, by the way. Who was little Albert, and how did a lab-grown phobia completely change the way modern products are marketed? This episode is about John B. Watson.
Meet John B. Watson. John B. was not Ivan. Where Ivan was methodical, obsessive, and slightly monastic, a man who slept on laboratory tables and genuinely liked his dogs, John B. was ambitious, charismatic, and almost catastrophically confident in himself. He was born in 1878 in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. His childhood was, by his own account, difficult. His father abandoned the family when John B. was 13. His mother was deeply religious and emotionally severe. John B. grew up with a significant chip on his shoulder and an enormous need to prove something to someone. He found his footing in academia. He was brilliant, genuinely brilliant, and by the age of 31, he was elected president of the American Psychological Association, the youngest person ever to hold that position at that time. But John B. had a problem with the psychology of his era, the same problem Ivan had. Too much guesswork, too much introspection, too many theories about thoughts and feelings and the mysteries of inner life of the human mind, none of which could be measured, none of which could be proven. John B. wanted to burn it down and start over. In 1913, he published what became known as the Behaviorist Manifesto. Its opening line is one of the most aggressive statements in the history of science. Psychology, as the behaviorist, views it as a purely objective, experimental branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behavior. Prediction and control. Not understanding, not empathy, not insight, control. John B. believed that if you understood the inputs, the stimuli, the environment, the conditioning, you could predict and shape what any human being would do. Free will, in John B.'s framework, was largely an illusion, a story we told ourselves. He had read Ivan. He believed Ivan completely, and he wanted to find out if Ivan's principles scaled up to the most vulnerable possible human subject. He found a baby. The baby's name in the published literature is Albert B., known to history as Little Albert. He was the son of a wet nurse who worked at the Harriet Lane Home, a children's hospital on the Johns Hopkins campus. Little Albert was selected, John B. wrote, because he was stolid and unemotional. He rarely cried. He seemed calm, stable. This is relevant. John B. wanted a baseline, a child who did not scare easily, so that any fear response produced by the experiment could be attributed clearly to the conditioning process and not to a pre-existing anxious temperament. Little Albert was specifically chosen because he seemed fine, and here's a myth we need to expel from school. Every textbook written about this experiment repeats Watson's exact description of little Albert as a healthy, stolid, and unemotional infant. It had been copied and pasted from psychology course to psychology course for over 100 years. But in 2009, a researcher named Hall P. Beck, more on him later, spent years tracking down the hospital records connected to the Harriet Lane Home on Johns Hopkins and discovered something Watson never disclosed. The child was not healthy. He was not neurologically normal. And the footage John B. himself filmed of the experiment shows it clearly. If you know what you're looking at, which nobody did for nearly 90 years, because Watson said he was fine and everyone believed him. John B. and his graduate assistant, a young woman named Rosalie Rayner, introduced little Albert at 9 years old to a series of objects. A white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, burning newspapers, a white cotton mask. Little Albert's response to all of them, mild curiosity, no fear. He reached toward the rabbit. He was interested in the rat. He was, by every measure, a calm and unflappable baby. They also confirmed something important. Little Albert had a fear reflex to one thing, one specific stimulus: loud noise. When John B. struck a 4-foot steel bar with a hammer directly behind little Albert's head, little Albert startled violently. He cried. He was frightened. The loud noise was little Albert's unconditioned stimulus. Fear was his unconditioned response. Just like Ivan's meat powder and saliva, except this time, the subject was a human child. 1 month later, little Albert, now 10 months old, the conditioning trials began. John B. placed the white rat in front of little Albert. Little Albert reached for it as before, calm, curious, unafraid. The moment little Albert's hand touched the rat, John B. struck the steel bar. Little Albert, startled, cried briefly, recovered. They did it again. Little Albert reached for the rat. Bar struck, startled, cried, recovered. They conducted 7 pairings in total across 2 sessions. After the 7th pairing, John B. placed the rat in front of little Albert without striking the bar. Little Albert began to cry the moment he saw the rat. He turned away from it. He tried to crawl away from it. He was frightened of a white rat he had happily reached for 1 month earlier. The neutral stimulus had become a conditioned stimulus. The fear, crying, withdrawal, avoidance was now a conditioned response. Ivan had been right. It worked on humans. 5 days later, following a quick weekend trip to Disneyland, which wouldn't actually open for another 35 years, John B. tested whether stimulus generalization applied to little Albert the way it had to Ivan's dogs. He presented little Albert with a white rabbit. Little Albert cried and withdrew. A white dog. Little Albert cried. A seal fur coat. Little Albert recoiled. A Santa Claus mask with white cotton trim. Little Albert cried. John Watson's own white hair. Little Albert became distressed. The fear had spread. It had generalized across everything sharing the quality of white and fluffy. Little Albert's nervous system had built the bridge Ivan described, and it had done so in 7 conditioning trials. 7. John B. published the results. The scientific community was astonished. Classical conditioning working on human infants? Fear could be manufactured, installed from the outside? Now here's where the textbook version of the story usually ends. Fear was conditioned, generalization occurred. Watson proved Ivan's principles applied to humans. Remarkable. Next chapter. But we don't do textbook versions here, because what happened underneath this experiment is slightly more disturbing than the experiment itself. Who was little Albert, really? For nearly 90 years, little Albert's real identity was unknown. Back in 2009, as mentioned earlier, Hall P. Beck spent years tracking down hospital records, employment files, birth certificates connected to the Harriet Lane home on Johns Hopkins. He identified the infant as a boy named Douglas Moretti, born to a wet nurse named Arvila Moretti, who worked at the hospital. The identification seemed settled, until Beck and his colleagues looked closer. Douglas Moretti, little Albert, medical records revealed something John B. never disclosed in any of his published research. Douglas, aka little Albert, was not healthy. He was not stolid and unemotional. He had hydrocephalus, a neurological condition, fluid on the brain, that causes developmental impairment, motor difficulties, and cognitive delays. It was congenital, present from birth. When child development experts were later shown the original film footage John B. had made of the experiment without being told who the baby was or what was the study, they noticed something immediately. One expert said, and I'm quoting directly here, "What bothers me the most, there's no startle to animals. There's something already gone wrong." Another noted that the baby's hand movements, instead of grasping gestures typical of a 10-month-old, little Albert used a flat scooping motion, a neurological flag. The child John B. described as the picture of calm normalcy was, in the opinion of researchers reviewing the footage a century later, showing clear signs of neurological damage in every frame. Douglas Moretti never learned to walk. He died at the age of 6. And the evidence, the medical records, the film footage, the hospital documents, make it, according to researchers, nearly impossible to believe that John B. did not know. He selected a sick child. He described him as healthy. He published the results as though the subject were a neurological normal infant, and he never went back to correct the record. It doesn't end there, though. In 2014, another research team proposed a different candidate for who was little Albert, a boy named William Albert Barger. The debate among historians is not fully settled. What is settled is this: John B. never deconditioned little Albert, whoever he was. He left that laboratory afraid of white rats, rabbits, dogs, fur coats, cotton balls, and old men with white hair, maybe even Santa himself. And Watson moved on. In 1920, the same year the Little Albert paper was published, John B. Watson was asked to leave Johns Hopkins University, not for the experiment, for an affair with Rosalie Rayner. Remember her? His graduate student, the one who had been in the laboratory every single conditioning trial, the one who helped strike the steel bar. His wife discovered the love letters, not quietly. His wife's brother was Harold Ickes, who would later become Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of the Interior. This was not a family that handled scandals quietly. The divorce proceedings became the front page news in Baltimore. The newspapers published excerpts from John B.'s love letters to Rosalie. Johns Hopkins gave Watson a choice: his relationship with Rosalie or his position at the university. And guess what? Watson chose Rosalie. He resigned and divorced. He married her on December 31st, 1920, and John B. Watson, the youngest ever president of the American Psychological Association, the man had published the Behaviorist Manifesto. The man who had just proved that human fear could be manufactured from scratch never returned to academic science. John B. Watson, who wanted to predict and control all human behavior, could not predict or control his own. And here's where it gets personal. In 1928, Watson published a parenting book. It was called Psychological Care of Infant and Child. It was a bestseller. It sold enormously, well across America and beyond. In it, Watson told parents directly, clearly, in plain language, never to hug their children, never to kiss them, never to let them sit in your lap. His exact words were, never hug and kiss them, never let them sit in your lap. If you must, kiss them once on the forehead when they say goodnight. Shake hands with them in the morning. He called the chapter that warned against maternal affection the dangers of too much mother love. He told parents to treat their children like small adults. Emotional displays were weakness. Affection created dependency. Conditioning, schedules, and behavioral control were the path to raising strong, resilient human beings. The book was written with enormous confidence by a man who had, remember, just proven that you could instill fear into a child's nervous system in 7 tries. Now imagine that same man telling an entire generation of parents how to raise their kids. And here's the part that should stop you completely. Watson raised his own children this way. His sons James and William, he kept emotionally distant. He withheld affection deliberately, not out of cruelty, but out of absolute conviction that this was scientifically correct. Both sons later attempted suicide. William died by suicide in 1954. His daughter from his first marriage also made multiple suicide attempts. The man who published a best-selling guide on how to raise emotionally strong children raised children who could not survive their own emotional lives. Watson's parenting books sold so well, this is disturbing, that its influence rippled across American families for decades. The idea that picking up a crying baby would spoil it, that affection created weakness, that emotional distance was strength. These ideas did not disappear when Watson left academia. They spread. They were adopted. They were passed from parent to child to grandchild, which means there is a high probability, otherwise known as a fat chance, that someone listening to this right now had a grandparent or great-grandparent raised under Watson's method, without ever knowing his name. His metronome is still ticking in some families, 3 or 4 generations later. Ivan would call that stimulus generalization on a civilizational scale. Following his leave from academia, John B. Watson walked right into the advertising agency, the J. Walter Thompson Company in New York City. He started, as all new employees did, at the agency by selling door-to-door and working behind the grocery counter at Macy's. Watson spent months doing this. The man who had been president of the American Psychological Association was standing behind a grocery counter in a department store. He called it research. And when he moved into the creative work, he brought a framework that would reshape American advertising entirely. Watson believed humans were capable of exactly 3 base emotional states: love, fear, and rage. Everything else was a variation, and his job, as he described it to his colleagues, was to connect products to those states. His own words: tell the consumer something that will tie them up with fear, something that will stir up a mild rage, that will call out a love response, or strike a deep psychological need. He ran campaigns for Johnson & Johnson baby powder, for Pond's cold cream, for Maxwell House coffee, for Scott paper products, not to be confused with Michael Scott of the prestigious Dunder Mifflin Paper Company. One Scott paper campaign showed surgeons standing over a patient in an operating table. The headline read, "And the trouble began with harsh toilet tissue." That advertisement was selling toilet paper using the fear of surgery. Watson believed humans were not rational buyers. They were emotional ones, and emotions, he had already proven in a laboratory, could be instilled from the outside. He had manufactured fear in a baby's nervous system, and now he was manufacturing desire in yours, and it worked. He eventually became vice president at J. Walter Thomas Advertising Company. He was enormously successful. The scientific community he had been ejected from largely ignored his advertising career, but every single framework he brought to that agency, emotional conditioning, stimulus response, paired associations, was Ivan's laboratory translated directly into commerce. The next time you feel an inexplicable pull towards a product you don't need, the warmth of a brand, the anxiety of missing out, the vague sense that you will be more lovable, more capable, more enough if you buy that thing, that is Watson's architecture. He built it, we live it. I want to spend a moment on Rosalie Rayner because the script of his story almost always buries her. She co-authored the Little Albert Papers. She was from one of Baltimore's most prominent families. She gave up her academic career when the scandal forced her out of Hopkins alongside John B. She married him on New Year's Eve 1920. They had 2 sons together. She wrote about marriage, about family, about the strange life of being a behaviorist wife. And by many accounts, she was the only person who could draw John B. Watson out of his shell, the only one who could make him present, human. Rosalie Rayner died on June 18, 1935. She was 36 years old. The cause was dysentery, contaminated fruit. Watson was 57. He was, by every account, devastated. He became increasingly reclusive. He withdrew from his sons, who were already growing up estranged from a father who had kept them at a deliberate emotional distance. He moved to a farm in Connecticut. He became a hermit, the man who had published a best-selling book arguing that emotional attachment was a form of weakness, spent the last years of his life undone by grief. Ivan would have called that a conditioned response. John B. would have been furious at himself for having one. Before he died in 1958, John B. burned his letters, his personal papers, his private correspondence, and letters. All of it gone. We don't know what he wrote. We don't know what he felt. We don't know if, in the end, he understood the contradiction he had lived. The man who wanted to predict and control all human behavior could not control his own grief, could not control his children's pain, could not control the irony of his own ending. He burned the evidence and died a recluse on a farm, and in a way that is deeply, darkly on brand for a man who spent his life studying behavior. He conditioned himself out of his own story. Here's what John B. proved and what he left unfinished. Fear is not always born. It is often made. The nervous system does not ask whether a fear is rational before it instills it. He asks only, did this signal predict something alarming? If the answer is yes, the bridge is built in 7 pairings in an infant in 1920, which means that many of the fears, aversions, and anxieties that you feel like permanent features of who you are, the ones that seem to have no origin, no memory, no traceable cause, may simply be little Albert's story written in a different language. Something was paired with something frightening enough times, and the bridge was built. The second half of John B.'s story, the part he never completed, is the question he left open. Can the bridge be dismantled? The answer is yes. But that discovery belongs to someone else, a researcher named Mary Cover Jones, who took a child named Peter and a rabbit and quietly undid what John B. had done. Without the scandal, without the headlines, without getting fired, she figured out how to take the fear apart. We'll get to her. Thank you for stepping into the laboratory today. And after all this research, he's just John B. to me. But unlike Ivan, John B. is not my guy. Drop a comment below. What is a fear that you have that you genuinely cannot explain the origin of? See you in the next experiment.